Morning, everyone. Thank you very much for joining this special session on Can India-Japan Partnership be the crucial pillar for a free and open Indo-Pacific? This is the second session under the series India-Japan Partnership Perspectives, organized by the Ananta Aspen Center with the support of the Nippon Foundation. The initiative aims to enhance strategic ties between two of the most vibrant democracies in Asia. The Center will be organizing several digital sessions under this series to explore the contours of this truly special partnership. We are very happy to have two great speakers for the session today. Professor Kanehara, Professor Doshisha University, former Assistant Chief Cabinet Secretary to the former Prime Minister Shinzo Abe and a former diplomat. Kanehara-san, thank you so much for joining us today. We are truly delighted. Pramit Pal Chaudhuri, Foreign Editor, Hindustan Times and Distinguished Fellow and Head Strategic Affairs, Ananta Aspen Center. Pramit, it's always a pleasure to have you with us. I will now request Pramit to please begin the proceedings.
Thank you, Harshit. I'll just mention if anybody who's watching either on Facebook or on the Zoom, please, you can send questions either via the chat function on the Zoom or through Facebook, and we will receive the questions via Facebook. Professor Kanehara, you were a key member of the Shinzo Abe government as it constructed, if you wish, its the Indo-Pacific strategy and concept over the past few years. How would you respond to the question that this webinar basically asks? Can India and Japan, or should India and Japan, be the cornerstone of the Indo-Pacific?
Yes, can I just start?
Please go ahead.
The India-Japan relationship is pivotal to sustain liberal order emerging in Asia. I have to say several points. One is India-Japan relationship is a natural alliance in terms of values, strategic weights, and economic integration. Let me start with the strategic balance here. 20th century was a cruel century. Wars, revolutions, and the upheavals everywhere, but the big wars, and American President Roosevelt shook hands of Stalin to defeat Hitler. And then President Nixon, he needed and he embraced Mao to defeat Stalin's Soviet Union. And by reflection, the Gandhi's India-born democracy was alienated. And in terms of values, universal values, there's a small distortion here. Now we are taking back Indians' hands, and Japan, US, India, Pacific, Indian-Pacific regions, three big democracies and big economies and strategic weights, we should sustain emerging the liberal order in Asia. My second point is liberal order is not based upon Western white Christian values. We are based upon our own values and they are universal. They have common things with Western universal values, what they say universal. In the former half of 20th century was cruel. There were two stories, international order. On the top, the colonial rulers were there. But the down, Asians, Africans were all colonized. There was no sovereignty, no dignity, and the harsh labor was there. But after second half of the 20th century, many Asians got independent, and many Asians got industrialized, and in the Western world, Reverend King, Mandela, Gandhi, they worked hard and they put down the racial discrimination as institutions. They're still there, but as institutions, they are dead. And beneath that, as Vivekananda said, what lies down there is love and truth. And Vivekananda says, It's like top of mountain. You can go there, but paths are plural. It's not only one way to reach the truth and love. Gandhi did not shoot any bullet. In Gujarat, he thought quietly, and he came to the conclusion that satyagraha, that's love and truth. And he shook, and he pulled down British Empire in India. That was the start of the huge wave of self-determination of Asians. And here we are together with the Westerners. They changed, we changed, and we are now sustaining one order, that's liberal order. It's not free. We earned this with a huge amount of bloodshed, sufferings, but we have it now. And who sustained this order? Natural leaders are, I have to say, Americans, of course, in the Pacific, Japan joined them, and India. This is our responsibility of 21st century. And the global strategic balance is a responsibility of the strategic powers. And I have to say, India is rising very quickly. Industrialization is tremendous change for everybody. In the late 18th century, when British started that, we didn't know them. British was not known very much in Asia, in Far East Asia. We knew Dutch, but not others very much. But they became a huge empire thanks to the power of industry. And Mughal Empire, Ottomans, Qing Dynasty, China, and Japan Tokugawa, they did not understand how quickly they could become powerful. And they came to Asia. They were there, but they were merchants. But after that, they became colonial rulers. But the Marx Weber says the industrialization is the privilege of the Europeans, Americans. It's not true at all. They believe that Asia will never develop. Asia developed. Industrialization can spread to any part of the world where people are honest and industrious. China took off finally, and they're taking back their own size. Now they're flying dragon in the sky. The next one is India. The Indians and Chinese, they have 1.3 billion people, the huge nations. They were already huge throughout 2,000 years. They were huge empires. But Chinese average age is now 39 years old. Japanese are 49 years old. We feel old. Indian average age is 29 years old. The future is Indians. And India will take off after China, and it will be a true superpower. And we have to be hands in hands. If China rises, yes, and they are now rising, but they are now 60% of world economy. But Japan, Europe, and United States and India together, we go beyond 50% of world economy. And China will be, can be a regional hegemon, but China cannot be a global hegemon as far as the Westerners or liberal order partners are united. And that's the reason I believe that in Asia, if Japan, United States, and India are united, hands in hand with Europeans, we could still engage China. And purpose is not to confront China. The purpose is to stabilize relationship with China, because engagement is not begging. Engagement is not being a vassal. Engagement is a persuasion, mutual persuasion on an equal footing. And as far as the West is united, we can still do that. That's the reason why Japan believes that the relationship with India in the future is vital. That's my message. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Kanehara-san, you've talked about two levels in which the Indo-Pacific, or at least the Indo-Japanese relationship works, which is on the strategic and on the values side. Let me just ask you, since you were in the Abe government, how did the thinking regarding the Indo-Pacific and the Indo-Japanese relationship evolve over the years that you were there?
Yes, I was serving in the first of the governments. It's roughly 20 years ago. And we launched already, I mean, Prime Minister launched the idea at that time in his first government. It's 20 years ago, roughly, 15 years ago. And at that time, I did the same. Now China rises. China was far smaller 15 years ago. They are still our size. But we saw China rises. We have to engage them. Then the liberal powers in the region must be cooperating with each other. And Prime Minister proposed Washington, Tokyo, Canberra, and Delhi. And it's constant idea for him. The balance, liberal order, it's the same all the time. And liberal order is not Western, it's universal. We share that. That's his own idea. But 15 years ago, I have to say, China was still small. Still, I mean, I was Japan size, and nobody was very much worried. And the Delhi said, why Canberra? And Canberra said, why Delhi? And we couldn't make a diamond cooperation before. And China was very much complaining about our diamond strategic thinking. But today, China doesn't complain. They feel big. Come on, that's them. And because China is so huge, the four nations are getting together. And this is because of physics, of international politics, but idea is always there with the Prime Minister Abe since his first government. He made a big speech in the Parliament of India when he visits India in his first government 15 years ago. And he quoted Darashiko. I don't know how I'm pronouncing good or bad, but the prince, and he said, two oceans are together. And that's the message of Prime Minister. We have to bring the Pacific and Indian Ocean together. Strategic framework is no longer Far East, no longer East Asia. It must be in the Pacific. And here we have to create a common order. That's his idea. And this speech was very warmly welcomed by the Indian Parliament. I was there, I remember.
You're correct. The famous confluence of the two seas. I remember. Yes. It was translated as in English at least. So yes, that speech, as you mentioned, it laid the basis for the idea of what we now call the Indo-Pacific. Yes. Since then, as you mentioned, he had a proposal for a diamond structure that did not take off. But now we have the Quad. We have the Malabar exercises. We have several trilaterals. We have the India, Japan, even in India, Japan, Australia, trilateral one with India, Japan, and the United States. We now have things like supply chain resilience initiative. Yes. We have many different, I think our foreign minister calls them strategic geometries. Yeah. How do you see them? And these are important because these are the means by which we hope to implement the idea of the Indo-Pacific into the reality on the ground. How does Japan see all of these fitting in? How do these pieces come together, if you wish? And which ones do you think, in your view, are going to be the most important in the next coming years?
Yes, the FOIP, free open in the Pacific, is a concept. It's just like X article of George Kennan. When he published it, there was no policies backing it up. He just laid down the path for coming century. We can't fight against Soviets because they have nukes, but we can sustain the status quo and they will change, they will collapse from inside. That's George Kennan. And then many policies came in after that, like patchwork, but the grand design was there. FOIP is the same thing. We don't fight against China, but we'll never lose our democracy. And they might change. Maybe it takes a century, but they might change. But there must be some patchworks to sustain this big concept. This huge concept is here. It's for a century. Now we have to put the flesh to this big bone. That's our job. So you mentioned Malabar supply chain initiative and Quads. These are all the patchworking necessary parts. We're putting that one by one. Some would fall maybe, some would stay there, but we have to continue to put patches and we have to continue this maybe until 2050. And we have to cooperate coming 3 decades at least. Then you'll be a superpower.
So you see all of these as basically, as you said, temporary patches until India hopefully becomes a superpower. Okay, this could take.
Yeah. And this Malabar should continue.
Right. Okay.
And Malabar should continue. The India was sticking to the non-alignment policy. It's very important. Just like Japanese pacifism, we are still sticking to that. But that's not hamper a strategic cooperation, because without stability, our ideal cannot be realized. So we have to sustain this strategic stability. And Malabar is a great step forward. And India was very cautious to invite two partners together. That makes somehow multilateral siding with one side. But now you are inviting Americans and Japanese and Australians. It's a huge change for us. I'm very happy to see that. Quad, you know, the Australia and Japan are very close because we fought in the war, with the Americans too. After the war, during the Cold War time, we reformed our alliances. American alliances are Japan, Korea, Philippines, Thailand, and Australia. I have to say that Korea is a bit confused strategically these days. Philippines and Thailand are, I have to say, not very strong. They're very good locations, but their army, navy are not very strong. Australia is tiny as a military power, but they speak English, and they're very well coordinating with Americans. So for us, it's natural to have coordination between Japan-US alliance and Australia-US alliance and Japan-Australia. India is a bit different. It's a future superpower, non-alignment policy, but this is the only one future superpower and democracy we have to engage. So it's very important to talk to the American allies and India, and this makes a stable Indo-Pacific. And this is a spine of this Indo-Pacific region, and we have to do that. Quad is useful. Quad is the place where Indian Ocean and Pacific US alliances can meet together and talk about stability in Asia. So supply chains are important too. This is not against China at all. We saw COVID hits everybody. Suddenly we believed in the globalization, that's market force, the global one markets, and the capital's money flows down to the nations where labor forces are skillful and cheap. We thought it's a good thing, but suddenly virus hit us, borders are back, and the factories in many nations are shut down, and we saw our supply chain globally extended, paralyzed suddenly. Now we have to make this supply chain resilient. Of course, there are security reasons too. Americans are thinking of the tech hegemony is now in question. They have to do something on that. So security reasons here and COVID influences here that make us think twice. The supply chain, and India is a future huge markets and huge economy. It's of course natural to think about India when we talk about resilience of supply chain of Japan.
But just a few more words on the supply chain resilience initiative. Now, what is interesting, of course, it does not include the United States. At least in its initial plan, you only have India, Australia, and Japan. So is there a plan to bring in other countries into that later on? And second, what you mentioned pharmaceuticals or medical issues. What areas do you see this initiative eventually covering? Electronics, pharmaceuticals, strategic minerals? What do you think? Is that something that's going to be worked out later? Or do you already have an idea of what's going to be there?
I'm not a very good economist, so I can't answer very clearly. I have to say that the United States today's US they have strong leadership for tech hegemony, and they say unity of the West. But the truth is, the unity is a bit in question because they are too strong and they're sort of drama-like. There's no team player. So we have to listen to the Americans. And if we make supply chains resilient, of course, Americans are welcome. But I think it's much better for if the Americans could be more consulting the allies and friends. We can do it. We're happy to have them. The supply chain is for the manufacturing, the electronics, and these things. We don't mind, Toys R Us toys are produced anywhere. We don't care. Chain shots. We don't die. But the electronics, it's widely spread, very widely spread. And we produce parts, export them to, say, China or India. They assemble things. But it's not only from Japan. They buy things from the United States or UK. And there are several things. We don't see the final products. It's assembled outside Japan and exported to the United States or Japan or Europe. But this is today's multilateral economy. And when it is shut or cut hurts outside Japan, we don't know what's happening there. So we have to have a responsible and stable partners, not only one partner, but partners. Maybe we are concentrating too much on China. In 1980s late, the big financial crisis hit Asia. Before that, many Japanese were in ASEAN nations, and they fled China. China rose very quickly, but this COVID thing and US-China tech war make us think twice. And before that, I have to say, the wages are going up in China already. Labor unions are becoming stronger. And partially already we're talking about China +1. We need more diversified supply chains. We're talking about that already. And COVID and tech war, US-China, just accelerating our thinking. And this is where we are, sir.
So one of the things one of the reasons you mentioned at the beginning that there was a degree of, should we say, distance between India and Australia regarding the Diamond and later the Quad, or at the same time, the Quad, of course, went through two different sort of avatars. Was the problem that in Australia there was no domestic consensus on the Quad? So when the Conservatives fell from power under John Howard and Kevin Rudd came to power, Rudd pulled out of the Quad, saying that he didn't think this fulfilled Australia's interests. America, they have a president right now who is, of course, America first, even though the rest of his administration is very sold on the Quad. Your government has now changed. Prime Minister Abe has unfortunately had to retire because of his health again, but Prime Minister Suga has come in. Do you see any change in either character or in terms of actual policies in the new Japanese government compared to what Prime Minister Abe had before him?
I see. The new Prime Minister Suga, served as Chief Cabinet Secretary to Abe-san for 8 years, and he knows exactly what he has to do. And in Abe's government, there are some division of labors. The national security, diplomacy, that's the direct jurisdiction of Prime Minister. So Foreign Ministry, Defense Ministry were instruments to support Prime Minister. Other domestic issues were in hands of Suga-san. And then the financial issues are in the hands of Finance Minister and Deputy Premier Aso-san. Constitutional issues, Komura-san in the party. And Abe-san had a very good team, very big shots. And he gave missions to them. And it was a very good team. And Suga-san is now stepping into Abe-san's shoes. So one, there's no reason for him to change Abe's policy simply because he is saying, I'm a successor. If it is opposition leader, he has to do something, anything but Abe. And for Prime Minister Suga, continuation is fine. This is stable. This was successful diplomacy. I'm gonna step into his shoes, and that's fine. And his priority today is domestic politics. For example, digitalization is hugely backward. I think we are much more backward than India. And it's just like Great Britain, the first precursor industrialization, and they are happy with their industry, and they feel behind. The same thing is happening here. We are so glad to have the industry a bit earlier than the other Asians, and the change is very slow. And nobody can attack a cyber attack because we are using paper still. The Suga-san is very angry, and he wants to change everything. That's his priority. So as far as foreign policy is concerned, he will quietly continue Abe's foreign policy. Maybe second year, third year, he will inject his own color, but it's going smoothly. That's fine for us, for Japanese.
Excellent. Just a reminder to those who are listening or watching us right now, if you have a question, if you're on Zoom, use the Q&A. The Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, click on that and you can put in a question. And if you're on Facebook, you just send a message to us and a question will be sent to us, and we will begin to look at those questions in about 10, 15 minutes from now. Kanehara-san, I'll just talk a little on the economics. We have seen under the Americans, under Steve Biegun, the US Deputy Secretary of State, Pompeo, and the others, have been pushing for, and we get the sense that the Biden administration will do something similar. The idea, building on something like the supply chain resilience initiative, something similar, that there should be technological coalitions. For example, 5G, we see already the US and Japan are working together. We have many alternatives. There's the Scandinavians, there's the Koreans, even the Taiwanese now are entering this. A pharmaceutical coalition built around certain technologies as well, and companies, aerospace, defense, all of these. Some of this is difficult. All governments, obviously, that if you're going to move or do a China +1 strategy, as you've mentioned, all governments will say, please build a factory in my country, don't build it anywhere else. That definitely was the Trump policy. Japan, in many ways, has been ahead of everybody else in the Indo-Pacific by saying that Japan would not only subsidize companies leaving China to come back to Japan, would even subsidize that decide to move to South Asia or Southeast Asia, anywhere other than China. How important do you think this is, that the governments have to become involved to ensure that the China plan works, or even the policy eventually develops among key supply chains or major companies? What is the government's role, and how do we coordinate this between ourselves?
I have to say, you have to think of three things. One is market force is working. It's much stronger than the government's force. And if China is the most profitable destination, they go there. It's difficult to put them back. But as I said, Chinese population is now shrinking, wages rising. So that's one reason why the investments is flowing out of China, going to say Vietnam, Myanmar, and then Bangladesh, India. It started already. And this is market force. This is not the government. Government intervenes only when we believe that this is for national security, or this is for industrial healthiness. And as I said, two reasons are here. One is security part. 5G is not market force. This is for the government. This is security. And 5G is local smartphone stations. 4G is hardware. 5G is software. This is huge change, because 4G is hardware. If you want to say eavesdropping of bad things, you have to go there, open the door, break the lock, go in there and put something there. But the cyberspace is awful. With one click, you can go there. You can change everything. So 5G is very vulnerable for eavesdropping. for even the sabotage in the conflicts. So we have to avoid any risk. We don't mention China. It could be any country that can hurt our national security. And the 5G's problem is you have to buy a whole system. There are only three: Huawei, China, Nokia, and Ericsson. Nothing else. Three. You have to choose one. And once chosen, you have to live with that as far as 5G continues. That system. Our NTT company is proposing another thing. Let's break this out. Make this open run. You can bring in any parts. That makes the system more transparent. I don't think this is spreading very fast, but this is our proposal. But 5G is one company forever as far as 5G continues. And this is vulnerable for cyber attack, hacking. And that's the reason why we are vigilant in establishing 5G network in Japan. And have I answered the questions? So governments can intervene, and they should intervene as far as national security. Market process is quite different.
One of the areas that we still, I think, what was seen on the Indian side is a continuing gap, if you wish, between the Indian-Japanese relationship has been the issue of military sales of Japanese equipment. India has been eager to buy Japanese equipment. We had, of course, the US-2 seaplane that has gone around in circles for a long time, and we're still waiting. We were interested in the Soryuz submarine, and there are many other areas. We know anti-submarine warfare. Japan is among the leading nations in that technology. But we have struggled. And at least when I've talked to the Indian side, I'm not saying that India is very good at buying weapons either, but the two bureaucracies, if you wish, in your government and my government, between the two of them, in short, nothing has happened. Our procurement system is difficult. And my understanding is that between the constitutional difficulties and the fact that Japanese bureaucracy is actually not used to selling weapons at all. They don't really understand how this works. We've not gotten anywhere. Do you see that changing anytime in the future? And what would be required for us to get that done?
There's no constitutional element involved. It's the policy in 1970s. The Prime Minister Miki, he was very pacifist. And he changed the policy of arms sale. And he said, we don't sell anything to anybody. Even Americans, we don't do anything with them. That's Miki's policy. And that's a total embargo of arms sales to any country. In the meantime, South Korea became the huge arms seller and exporter. And they took our place of the pre-war imperial time. Now they are the biggest exporter of arms in Asia. And we are now very much far behind South Koreans. And Prime Minister Abe, after Miki, 30 years, it took 30 years, Prime Minister Abe said, now we have to change that. We don't sell anything to terrorists, enemies, but we have to sell things to friends. That's Abe's policy. But unfortunately, so long time, our defense industry did not invest to sell things to foreign countries. They lost totally their capabilities. They don't know how to do that. The government has not much experience. And I have to say, we have to do that again. But you said, sir, you mentioned Soryu. That's our best submarine. The new one is coming. It's a different one. But we tried to sell that to the Australians. And French defeated us, amazingly. And they said they have much superior the submarines, and they showed the paper, only paper. And they defeated us. We saw the real Soryu to them, to the Australians. And the French said, we can make a much better one. And by showing a sheet of paper, they won the contracts. I'm sure that they have great difficulties because it's not easy. And then our industry defeated, that shocked them, and they're still licking wounds.
That's correct.
We have to re-engage them. And I have to say that the president of Japan's arms sale as a policy that changed in principle 1 to co-development. We have many precedents. So if you say buy, it poses another hurdle because some pacifists say we don't sell these things. But co-developments is another domain. And there are many precedents there. And if you say just hacks or anything, but if you say co-developments, it changes the hurdles a bit lower than usual. And you have to stick because in the first place, our Navy, submariners are so closed. We had great difficulties to persuade our submariners to sell Soryu to Australia. Finally, they're okay. And we have to restart whole process again. You have to stick to that one. 2, you have to say co-development. and then we have to, on our part, we have homeworks. We have to persuade again our Navy, persuade again our industry. And the failure with Australia was a big shock for them. Now they are now flat on the floor. We have to galvanize them again.
As you mentioned, the latest generation of Soryu is, I think, the first diesel-electric submarine to use lithium-ion batteries. Lithium-ion technology, which is no other country in the world uses that, and totally changes the capacity and the range and so on of submarines. And unfortunately, I know India is now moving towards a new strategic partnership policy with submarines, but unfortunately, there's no Japanese company there. But co-development, yes, that has been a big success in India. We've done this with Russia. We've done it with the Israelis, largely in the missile space. But it's considered one of the great successes. And with any hope, with any luck, we'll start to see that happening with Japan. I'm going to trust.
You have to think of you're now nuclear power, right? If you want a nuclear submarine, we don't have it.
That's correct. No, we're not. I mean, we have an arrangement with Russia for nuclear ballistic submarines for our nuclear deterrent. But the conventional Navy, if you wish, uses diesel electric still. We do not use. We don't have access.
Yeah, because it's very different.
Separate two different types of submarine.
Nuclear propulsion attack submarines are noisy, very noisy, but very fast. So they can flee from the battlefields after shooting torpedoes. Ours are very quiet but slow because it's diesel.
Right.
So tactics are very different. Australia said, as quick as nuclear submarines, as quiet as Japanese submarines. We said, you can never do that. Our friends said, we can do it. They can never do it. But you have to choose either one. Strong, fast nuclear attack submarines or very quiet, but lethal, quiet submarines and diesel. If you go on the diesel one, you should stick to that. You should push the governments because everybody is so tired of big failure.
So good. Anyway, I will start turning to questions. As I noticed, we already on the Q&A, we already have 25 questions, and that should keep us engaged. Where do you see I mean, we've just had Steve Biegun, the US Deputy Secretary of State, say that at present there is no scope for expanding the Quad. But we do know that the Americans were interested in this idea and had, in fact, in their conversations, in their discussions with India and other Quad members, had always brought in South Korea, sometimes Vietnam, sometimes New Zealand into their discussions. So we assume that in the back of the mind of Washington, at least, the idea of Quad expansion is there. Do you see that as something that makes any sense? And more, perhaps, should I say, what would be the conditions that would allow us to consider something like that, the expansion of the Quad?
Thank you very much for the question. We have to consolidate the Quad in the first place, just born this year. So we have to consolidate this, build trusts, and the co-exercise, the military, and the economic, say, the resilience of supply chains and, arms export. We have to accumulate the good precedents for consolidating Quads. One, so we're happy to introduce the big ones in the region. I have to say the most now reliable American alliances in the Pacific is Japan, US, and Japan, the US, Australia. Indian Ocean sides, the superpower in the future, India. So it's natural to make a diamond. This is original idea of Prime Minister Abe 15 years ago. South Korea is now, the economic size is size of Russia. Amazing, isn't it? It's a huge economy today. And the military is 600,000, close to 700 already. A huge land power, army power in Asia. They don't have nuclear weapons, they abandoned that. But their military force is lethal. But unfortunately, their oscillation of domestic politics is huge. Lee Myung-bak is very close to the Americans, much closer than the Japanese. But today's Moon Jae-in president, he's very close to, say, North Korea and China. And Kang Kyung-hwa, his foreign minister, said under pressure of China openly that Japan, Tokyo, Washington, Seoul would never become an alliance, she said. So without the strategic directions convergence, we can't have Quads with South Korea, and they would refuse that. And Vietnam, New Zealand, but in the future, first place, we have to consolidate this Quad thing. And I have to say, this Quad is a maritime alliance in a way, and good navy, good naval power is required. And I have to say, these four nations are capable of doing that. And this is not FOIP. FOIP is much bigger, strategic, many other aspects here involved. Should involve everybody. Quad is for a strategic stability. Then we need some size. And we have to consolidate the first place, the big force, and then expand slowly to outside. That's my comments. That's okay?
One of the other questions here is asked, how strong do you believe, or how credible do you think in the long term is America's commitment to the Indo-Pacific? America has already had two isolationist presidents, Obama and Trump, and we have seen a sense in America, at least, that they are overextended internationally, definitely visible in the Middle East. Is that a concern, or should we say, how far do you think we can go with the Americans, or how much should we consider the Americans in our long-term strategic plans? And should India and Japan therefore be working perhaps separately? We are in many ways already, without America necessarily in our mind.
The United States has two faces, isolationist vis-a-vis the Atlantic and the interventionist vis-a-vis the Pacific. After the Second World War, they engaged themselves on both sides of the ocean. And sometimes they feel, we are just not Asians, not European, we are Americans, we are here. And by instinct, sometimes they turn inside. That happens very often with Americans. We have to be careful about their isolationist instinct. But I have to say, still, the military forces, US military is a huge one. It's $800 billion budget. It's 1% of world GNP. And world GNP is 1% is Pentagon. It's amazingly big. China is now 70% of American economic size, 70%, it's huge, 3 times bigger than Japan. But American military budget is 16 times bigger than the Chinese military budgets. They are still huge. So militarily, they're still very capable. This is one. So economically, they are shrinking in proportion still, shrinking still. But with Americans, Europeans are the same size. And we are 1/4 of American or European size. India is 1/3 of Japan, but becoming very quickly big. And together with this realignment of the American friends, we go easily beyond 50% of world GNP. And still Americans can control world affairs. And this is most important part. That's the empire of ideology. Americans, liberalism, freedom. And the 19th century was awful century for the Asians because the colonial powers came to us. But inside Europe, that's the age of freedom, parliamentarism, and Enlightenment thinking came to reality. It's 19th century for the Europeans. The reason why they say it's the century of light. It's darkness for us, but for the Europeans, it's century of light. Because equality, freedom, and equality of the dignity of each individual the same. This spread in the Europeans. The Americans were born with that idea. They have no history. They have only principle. The principle comes from, say, French and British Enlightenment thinking. They are very faithful to that. Without that, there would be no America. That's the core, the soul of Americans. And Brexit, Europeans are in trouble with liberalism. Americans themselves are divided, very much shaken. In Asia, this liberal order is just being born. India and Japan were, from the beginning, the second half after the war, from the beginning, democracies, but the others are all dictators. In 1986, Philippines took back their democracy they lost after the independence war against the United States. The Korea, Taiwan took back their independence, their democracy. ASEAN nations turned to democracy one by one. It happens only in 1990s. It's only a quarter of a century past. Very proud democracies. They have problems, a lot of problems, Rohingya or extrajudicial killing of the drug dealers, yes, but they're very proud. Even Kingdom of Thailand is shaken for democracy. And this trend is real. And I believe that Americans will not betray the ideal of liberalism, and they'll be committed. So the one reason is militarily they are strong enough. Second, economy is booming here in Asia, and Europe is going down, Americans are going down, Japanese too, but shrinking. But the booming part is in Asia. They will not neglect that. Thirdly, they'll be faithful to their ideals and ideas, and they will never abandon free Asia. Okay.
So one of the questions asked is that where do we see so as we know, as you've mentioned, already discussed the problems in terms of defense, hardware cooperation, in terms of purchases and co-development, and hopefully we'll see something in the future on that front. But second, one of the questions is that Malabar, while it's all very nice as an exercise, it is still ultimately just an exercise. It doesn't even have full interoperability. Do we, on the Quad, as you mentioned, is still coming together. Does an alliance structure actually make sense? Are the cost benefits of having an alliance, let's say 10 years from now, or over time, built around either the Quad or some other structure? You mentioned America obviously has a set of bilateral alliances, but within the Indo-Pacific, unlike, let's say, in Europe, there is no concept of collective security. So does this make sense that at some point we need to be looking at that idea? Is the word alliance, you mentioned non-alignment is now slowly disappearing off the Indian horizon, if you wish. But the word alliance remains a dirty word, I think, for all of us, except in the case of Japan, it was your relationship with the United States. But almost every Asian country, when they say, could you consider an alliance with another Asian country? They say, no, that's not acceptable. And at present, we still don't have any. So is alliance where we should be looking at?
First of all, American Pacific Alliance system is not very strong, as strong as NATO. It's bilateral, and many of American allies are maritime allies, not continentals, except Korea. There's no land army, big army here among American allies. And now China is rising to counterbalance China. We have to think of strategic balance. That's the reason why we're taking hands of Indians to make this to turn this into military alliance. We are already with alliance with Americans, so it's easy to talk to Australians. The big question is India, because you are becoming superpower. And it's very difficult to engage superpower anywhere. China is becoming very difficult these days. And would India choose alliance with the Pacific Alliance of the United States? If it comes to reality, I'm happy to discuss about it. But I think the Delhi would have great difficulties pressure your own people. And Americans, if we talk about the alliance, we have to talk the real alliance. We have to talk about the possibility of co-defense actions. Americans, that's always Article 5 in any alliance treaty with us, with the NATO, with the Koreans. The Article 5 is co-defense action. That's collective self-defense. You have to specify where and how you would cooperate. And India is a huge landmass power. And in Himalayan mountains there, you have great difficulties. Now it's difficult to defend. It's very high mountains there. And if you expect our army going there, it's not very easy. But I have to say, we are in alliance with the British and defeated Russians the early 20th century. And the British is not a very strong army. And they always wanted to send our army to Kashmir. So we said, in the first place, okay, up to Singapore, we can send our army.
Right.
And they said to India, they said, Afghanistan, Kashmir, go there. We said, finally, we said, okay, up to India, we might go. But we refused to go to Europe. Our Navy went to Europe in the First World War. It's beyond the obligation of the alliance. And our national power cannot be extended very easily because we have 250,000 forces only. It's 1/3 of South Korean army, and it's much smaller than yours, much smaller than the Americans. So if we cooperate, I think it will be rather maritime cooperation. You can't help your huge army in the mountains. Americans will not do that neither. And I don't think you will send your army to the United States to help them. But maritime cooperation is a very good part. And there we can truly have a serious discussion about cooperation.
So speaking about Indo-Japanese cooperation, there are a large number of questions about, for example, especially because China, as you mentioned, is right now once again at the forefront of our strategic thinking. We are cooperating with Japan, or trying to cooperate with Japan, in third countries, in connectivity projects and in infrastructure, in attempting, if you wish, to counter the Belt Road Initiative of China to some degree. Also working with countries, should we say, trying to help bring countries like Myanmar into the mainstream and give them alternatives to China. So I know as you said, you're not an economist, but this is obviously now extremely geoeconomics, if you wish, it's very strategic. Where do you see India and Japan working together? Because within the Quad, curiously enough, I would argue this kind of cooperation, whether it's connectivity, infrastructure, these areas, we're seeing India and Japan arguably working the closest among the Quad members.
Thank you. Maybe two levels are different. When we talk about the simply market of infrastructure, then we have to follow market force. In 1970s, we kicked out Americans and Europeans from Asia, our general constructors. In 1990s, Koreans kicked us out. And today, China is kicking out Koreans. This is market force. And their labor force is so cheap, and they can do this. Technology is not so bad. So China is penetrating everywhere. And to counter that, we have to show options, because sometimes the Chinese practice is not very good. They lend too much money to small countries. They take over mountains. They take over ports. That's very famous incident is Hambantota in Sri Lanka. They lend too much money, and Sri Lankans cannot return money. And China said, not a birth, whole port with authority of security. It's 99 years. It's revenge of Hong Kong. This is new colonialism. And Hambantota is not, a very important port for a container ship. If this port is useful, it's for Navy. So we have to think of their naval second thoughts, naval constellations, or global strategic locations. And there we have to be careful. And sometimes we have to counter Duqm in Oman. They have a huge dry dock, the biggest one, maybe only one in Indian Ocean. China lent a huge amount of money to Oman. British came in. They asked Sultan to declare that Duqm is open to everybody. And sometimes for these strategic matters, naval matters, we have to be vigilant. But for market force part, we have to compete and show options. But this is the market force that decides the results. And it's not easy to compete with the Chinese there.
Let's talk a little about the digital side. As you mentioned, data is going to be the future. Digital economies are going to be the future of the 21st century. Japan is the master of analog manufacturing. It is also the master of digital manufacturing right now. And as you may know, India, for example, has done well, or Indian companies have done well in TQM, which in many ways is the first stage toward digital manufacturing. We are the, after Japan, Indian companies are the second largest holder of Deming prizes, for example, in the world. But we're now starting to see, it's argued that besides digital manufacturing, we're starting to see in India the rise of a set of digital, for better word, super apps is what we're calling them in the Indian media. China's already had these under Tencent, Alibaba. We are now seeing Reliance Jio in Facebook. We're seeing another one built around Amazon. We're seeing another one built around Walmart, Flipkart. We're seeing a fourth one built around the Tatas. Japan has companies in this space, like Rakuten, for example, comes to mind, but there are companies who do e-commerce, digital payments, so on and so forth. And would be useful, I think, we would like to see as many such players as possible, in particular because the Indian government has quietly ensured that no Chinese company can build such a super app in India. Tencent, Alibaba are being deliberately kept from that. Do you see digital as being an area where Japanese companies who are otherwise very cautious, could they come to India and be partners or set up, be part of this larger super app ecosystem that is developing in India?
Yeah, I hope that our Rakuten or SoftBank can do it. But the one, we don't speak English. This is a huge barrier here. And they are not very much outward looking people. But I have said that the digital world is divided into two parts, the Chinese part and the Western part. Right. And these platforms are decoupled already because China never accepts GAFA, Google, Apple, Amazon, these things. It's decoupled already. Rather, Chinese are implanting TikTok and WeChat in our system, and they absorb huge amount of data and send it back to China. So Americans are angry. They're kicking out TikTok and WeChat. This is what's happening here. And I have said Europeans, Japanese network companies are defeated. And we are no longer competing at all. And India is coming in. You have no legacy industrial basis. That's your huge strength. China is strong in that point. They don't have to replace things. Network, and it's done. You know, 50 million people are connected by communication, say. You know, how many years it took to put people, 50 million on the plane? 6 to 8 years. You know, how many days we needed to connect people with Pokemon?
Yes.
It's 2 weeks. Networking is a huge, a tremendous changer of the world. And the newcomer is much faster to transform themselves. You can do it. And I think we are happy to do that, help you. And the Americans will help you. And you are democracy. You don't fear Google and GAFA, right? Chinese fear the free flow of ideas. You don't, you compete with them. And I have to say, China is now slowly excluded from the most sensitive part of the research in the United States. But they are very talented people. And Americans need talented people. Only India can produce the same number. You know, very strong in logical thinking, very strong in mathematics, much better could be than Chinese in this logical world, new worlds. You can truly have huge potential in this domain. And we are happy to help you, but I don't know which company will do that. In Cambodia, they have currency. They don't have currency today. They use dollar. Amazing, isn't it? They use dollar. And so without using cash, Cambodians are thinking now digital currency produced by the government. And there, Japanese are working on that. We have some good companies, but these are venture companies, not big ones. But you could pick up some good ones from Japan, and I think they're happy to cooperate with you because India is a huge market and open to the foreign investors.
Well, actually, India is just putting together a national digital currency policy. Originally, our central bank had opposed such policies, but has now begun reversing that. And part of the reason that is that China announced that they were going to build their own digital yuan or digital renminbi. And the Indian government felt that therefore this is now becoming a strategic issue and has now begun to reverse the original policy set by the central bank. So I think that is definitely an area which India and Japan should consider working together.
Yes.
So Kanehara-san, we are now almost at the end of our conversation, and we still have a number of questions. Do you have any concluding comments to make about the Indo-Japanese relationship and the future of that relationship? Where do you see what can be done? We're still noticing Japanese companies that prefer Vietnam over India for investment. Indian government is trying to change that. We've mentioned that digital is an area that while Japanese companies say they have an English barrier, but the point I always tell Japanese companies when they say this, I said, this does not stop the Chinese from coming here. Their English is worse than Japanese, but they still come. So you need Koreans have been here for decades and their English is they've done very well in India. So you need to get over this barrier. It's not necessarily, doesn't have to be a barrier for you. So anything you wish to comment with before I bring this to you?
Because the world is changing much faster than we expected. And the digital currency, DX is now huge, and digital currency is coming. Banks are shrinking.
Correct.
And private companies digital. That's the reason why central banks on earth are working on that very seriously, because they could be swallowed by irresponsible, digital currency companies. They can't accept it. Mobility is coming. The automatic driving is coming. Now our companies are making flying cars. It's real. They're flying already. So Tokyo is so congested. Now they're flying.
Right.
Amazing, isn't it? They're truly flying cars. And the digitalization is everywhere. Pharmaceuticals, and this expands our daily cyberspace. And that will change drastically our daily life. I'm not talking about cybersecurity, it is important, but our life itself is changing. If you go to NTT, they're making your second ego, second Kanehara. You buy it, you talk to it every day. At the age of 90, you start to lose your memory. Your computer talks to you. Do you remember your name? And this is becoming real. Everything is becoming real. And there we have huge potential for cooperation, but it could be beyond our imagination today. And India is very talented people for logical thinking, and you're fit to DX world. And we wish very much that we could cooperate with you. We're very good in manufacturing, Japanese, like Germans. But digital worlds, I have to say, Japan, Germany are a bit behind.
Right.
And the new nations without the legacy of industry is jumping ahead, like China. And India would make a big leap. Maybe we should follow you. And this is a new era for cooperation. We should think ahead.
Excellent, thank you. Kanehara-san, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you very much for having me.
And I know that the India-Japanese relationship in many ways is now, I would argue, at least for India, strategically one, if not the most important, one of the top two relationships that we have in the world. And it continues to expand. And as you've mentioned, that we hope that Prime Minister Suga will continue the policies of Prime Minister Abe. So we expect to see a lot more happening on that front. With these words, I bring this to a close. We are, I think, just a few minutes over time, but I think we're covered a lot of ground. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. Thank you, Aspen Institute. Thank you.